For months ago, I lost my wife to lung cancer after she battled the disease for nearly 3 years. We were married for 8 years, and her passing has left a huge void in my life. But today, I want to talk about something else that's been weighing on me. My relationship with her son, Michael, from her previous marriage. It's been complicated, to say the least. I first met Michael when he was 11. His dad had died in a car accident when Michael was just 6, so he was still dealing with that loss when I came into the picture. Right from the start, Michael made it clear he didn't want me around. My wife and I dated for about 1.5 years before we got married. But even that time didn't change how he felt about me. Things got even trickier because of Michael's grandparents on his dad's side, George and Patricia. They'd been a big part of Michael's life after their son died. When my wife suddenly became a single mom, they stepped up to help her out a lot, watching Michael while she worked to get back on her feet financially. She'd been between jobs when her first husband passed away, and even with life insurance, money was tight. Because of all they'd done for her and Michael, my wife felt like she owed them. They'd been there during her hardest times, and they were also Michael's last link to his dad. So, cutting them out of the picture wasn't an option, even though they clearly didn't like me. They thought my wife had moved on too fast, even though she waited 4 years after her husband's death before she started dating again. The first time I met George and Patricia was at one of Michael's school plays. I tried to shake George's hand, but he ignored me and turned away. Patricia gave me a quick, cold nod before focusing completely on Michael. My wife whispered an apology, but I told her it was okay. I got that they were protective of their grandson, but their attitude toward me didn't change even years after we got married. I stepped up and took on all the responsibilities of being a dad. I drove Michael to school, helped him with his homework, went to his soccer games, cooked meals, and did everything else a parent would do. But Michael hardly ever showed any gratitude. Whenever I tried to set rules or discipline him, he'd often snap back with, "You're not my real dad." One time, when he was 13, he stayed out past his curfew with friends. When he got home, I told him he was grounded for the weekend. He threw his backpack on the floor and said, "You can't ground me. You're not my dad." When my wife backed me up, Michael stormed off to his room and called his grandparents. 20 minutes later, George called me, furious, saying I had no right to discipline his grandson. Stuff like this happened a lot over the years. My wife always supported me, but she was in a tough spot. She couldn't just cut off George and Patricia, who kept undermining our relationship by telling Michael I was trying to replace his dad. I understood Michael was struggling. He was dealing with losing his dad and adjusting to a new family dynamic. I tried to be patient, but even as the years went by, his coldness toward me didn't really change. When Michael was 15, he refused to go on a family vacation with us and chose to stay with his grandparents instead. My wife was really upset, but she didn't push him to come. While we were away, George and Patricia took Michael to visit his dad's grave and then to all the places his dad used to love. When we got back, Michael was even more distant than before. By the time Michael was in high school, things kind of settled into a routine of just tolerating each other. He wasn't openly hostile anymore, but he stayed distant and formal. He spent most of his time with friends and barely at home, which meant we didn't clash as much. I kept doing all the parent stuff without expecting much in return, figuring this might be as good as it gets between us. We fell into this unspoken routine. I'd cook dinner, he'd eat quickly and then disappear into his room. On weekends, he'd leave early and come back late. We barely talked except for the basics. My wife kept trying to bring us closer. She'd plan family activities or dinners, but Michael usually found an excuse to skip out early or not join at all. 3 years ago, my wife found out she had stage 3 lung cancer. The news completely changed our lives. For the first year, she kept working while going through treatment, but eventually, she got too sick and had to stop. I took over everything, handling our finances and making sure she got the care she needed. When we first got the diagnosis, Michael, my son, stayed in the room with me for over 3 hours as we tried to process it all. We didn't talk much, but for once, there was no tension between us. That quiet moment of being together didn't last long, though. Michael soon went back to his usual habit of avoiding tough situations. We had some savings and our health insurance covered most of the medical bills, but there were still a lot of extra costs. On top of that, Michael was getting ready for college. Even though money was tight, he insisted on going to an expensive school across the country instead of a more affordable state school where he'd gotten a partial scholarship. When my wife tried to explain our financial situation, Michael got upset and accused her of not caring about his future. The argument left her drained and in tears. She was going through intense treatment that month and didn't have the energy for fights. Seeing her so upset was heartbreaking. Since my wife was too sick to deal with the conflict, I talked to Michael privately and made him a deal. I'd pay for his tuition and living expenses if he promised not to stress out his mom. He could go to whatever school he wanted, as long as he kept things calm at home. Michael agreed right away. But then he asked for an off-campus apartment instead of staying in the cheaper dorms, saying they were too noisy for studying. Later, I found out from his social media that he was actually throwing parties there. After some back and forth, I gave in. I just didn't have the energy to argue about it. To his credit, Michael kept his promise. He was really kind to his mom during her last few years. Whether it was because of our deal or because he genuinely cared didn't matter to me. All that mattered was seeing my wife happy in her final days. When Michael came home, he'd spend hours sitting with her, watching her favorite shows or just talking. He brought her little gifts from school and showed her pictures of his life there. Those moments meant the world to her. When she was too weak to get out of bed, he'd bring his laptop and take her on virtual tours of museums she'd always wanted to visit. Those small things brought her so much joy. My wife never found out about the deal I made with Michael. She thought it was George and Patricia, our friends, who were covering his college expenses. I never corrected her because I didn't want to add to her stress. She passed away believing that Michael and I had somehow managed to fix our relationship on our own. As her health got worse, I took time off work to care for her full-time. The medical bills kept piling up, and I had to start using our retirement savings to cover them. Michael's tuition and apartment costs were an extra strain, but I never brought it up with my wife. She already had enough on her plate. When my wife's health took a sudden turn for the worse, Michael flew home. In the week before she passed, he mostly avoided me, which was pretty typical for us. He'd sit with his mom while I handled meals or her medications, but as soon as I walked into the room, he'd leave. Even as we both watched her slipping away, we kept up this awkward dance of avoiding each other. The day before her funeral, something unexpected happened. Michael came into the kitchen while I was making calls to people about the funeral. He stood there awkwardly for a moment, then said, "Thank you for taking care of her," and then he just broke down and hugged me. I was already struggling with my own grief, and his sudden emotion completely caught me off guard. I hugged him back, and we cried together. In that moment, all the years of tension between us seemed to melt away in our shared sadness. After that, Michael's attitude toward me changed completely. He helped with the funeral arrangements and stayed by my side during the service, something I never would have expected. The next day, he apologized for how he'd treated me in the past. He admitted he'd been unfair and explained that he'd been scared of losing his connection to his dad. He said he'd taken out his anger on me because it was easier than facing his fears. He even confessed that his recent behavior had gotten worse because he was terrified of losing me too and becoming an orphan. He'd been demanding and cold because he didn't know how to deal with everything he was feeling. I told him I got where he was coming from and said maybe we could work on having a better relationship going forward. I made it clear I wasn't trying to take his dad's place but hoped we could at least be on good terms. After that talk, Michael's attitude toward me changed for the better. He stayed for 3 weeks after the funeral before heading back to university, and during that time we actually had some nice conversations. He started helping out around the house without me asking and even cooked dinner a couple of times, something he'd never done before. Even after he went back to school, he called regularly and came home to visit every few weekends. When he was here, we'd go for drives or watch sports together. He began asking about my job and telling me about his classes. We weren't super close, but compared to how things were before, it was a huge improvement. I thought we were finally building the kind of relationship I'd always wanted. Then, last week, I found out something that really bothered me. Michael was in the shower during one of his visits, and I went to his room to grab a phone charger. I noticed a folded piece of paper sticking out of his backpack. Right away, I recognized my wife's handwriting, even though it was shaky, like it had been in her last few months. I know I shouldn't have read it, but I couldn't help myself. The letter looked worn, like it had been read over and over. In it, my wife talked about how glad she was that Michael had finally come to terms with her illness and had been spending meaningful time with her. The first part was about their relationship, but the second part was about me. She wrote that Michael should try to fix things with me after she was gone. She mentioned that since she got too sick to work, we'd been having money troubles, and while George and Patricia might help him now, they wouldn't always be around. She said it would be smart for him to build a connection with me because I was kind and would look out for him. She told him not to ruin things with the only parent-like figure he'd have left. What really got to me wasn't what the letter said. It was the fact that the whole second paragraph about me was scribbled out with angry pen marks. The paper was torn in some spots where the pen had pressed down really hard, like Michael had been furious when he read that part. There were even little holes where the pen had stabbed through the paper. When Michael came out of the shower, I brought up the letter. He froze in the doorway of his room, his face shocked when he saw the paper in my hands. For a second, he didn't say anything. "Where did you find that?" he finally asked. "It was sticking out of your backpack. I recognized your mom's handwriting," I told him. Michael sat down on the edge of his bed, running a hand through his wet hair. He explained that his mom's lawyer had given him the letter after she passed away, and at first, he'd been really upset by her suggestion that he should fix things with me for financial reasons. The idea that our relationship should be based on practicality instead of real feelings had made him angry. But after thinking it over, he'd decided to follow her advice anyway, which is why he'd reached out to me before the funeral. He said the scribbled-out part of the letter was just his initial reaction, not how he felt now. "At first, I was only doing what Mom wanted," he admitted. "But over the last few months, I've realized she was right about you. Not because of money, but because you've always been there for me, even when I made it difficult." He said that while his behavior had started out as calculated, he'd grown to genuinely care about me over time. He begged me not to take the crossed-out paragraph the wrong way, explaining that he'd marked it up in a moment of anger but had since changed his mind. I studied his face, trying to figure out if he was being honest. After years of him being distant, followed by this sudden change that lined up with his potential financial needs, I wasn't sure I could fully trust what he was saying. I told Michael I needed some time to think things over and asked him to stay with his grandparents until his flight back to university the next day. He argued, crying and insisting that his feelings for me were real now, but I stood firm, saying I needed space. He kept trying to convince me, following me from room to room, until I finally repeated my request more firmly. Reluctantly, he packed his things and left. After thinking it over for a couple of days, I came up with a way to figure out if Michael's recent friendliness was genuine or just because he wanted money. I texted him, saying I was ready to move past our issues, but from now on, he'd have to cover his own tuition and living expenses. With only 2 years left in school, it wasn't an unfair ask. Plenty of students work or take out loans to get by. What Michael didn't know was that my wife and I had a joint will that wouldn't be revealed until we both passed away. Despite what my wife had hinted in her letter, we'd actually set aside money for Michael's future, along with some family heirlooms. I'd also included him in my part of the will since I don't have any close relatives to leave my things to. But Michael had no idea about any of this. His reaction to my text was instant and intense. He called right away, but I let it go to voicemail. Then he started blowing up my phone with texts, each one more frantic than the last. Over the next week, he sent me hundreds of messages, pleading with me to change my mind. He insisted he didn't care about the money and said he was too overwhelmed with grief to deal with the added stress of handling his own finances. One message said, "Please don't do this. I can't handle losing Mom and dealing with this too. I need your support right now." Another read, "I know I was awful to you for years, but I'm trying to make things right. Please don't pull the rug out from under me now." The sheer number of messages and how desperate they were made me second-guess myself. Was I being too hard on him? Was this test just a way to punish him for years of pushing me away? I started to wonder if I was being too harsh or even manipulative. I was already dealing with my own grief, and this situation was making things even harder. For days, I didn't reply to his messages, unsure of what to do. After talking to a few close friends, I decided to stick to my decision. If Michael really wanted a relationship with me, he'd understand why I had doubts after years of being distant, only to suddenly change when money might be involved. One friend pointed out that even if Michael's change of heart started because of money, the fact that he was so panicked now might mean he truly cared about our improved relationship, no matter how it began. I sent him a message explaining that while I felt bad about the situation, my decision was final. I told him I was there to support him emotionally, but financially, he'd need to take care of himself from now on. I made it clear that if he was okay with these terms, we could keep working on our relationship. If not, well, that would speak for itself. A week went by with no reply. Michael was supposed to visit that weekend, and usually, I'd buy his plane tickets, but this time I didn't. I wasn't sure if he'd still come without me covering the cost. To my surprise, he showed up anyway. He'd bought his own ticket. When I opened the door, he hugged me right away, crying. It was an emotional moment for both of us, and it hit me that despite everything we'd been through, we were both mourning the same loss. He looked rough. His clothes were wrinkled, like he'd thrown them in a bag last minute, and he had dark circles under his eyes. He seemed completely worn out. I invited him in, and we had a real, honest talk. He admitted that my doubts made sense, given our history and how he'd reacted to the letter. He said the part about me in the letter had made him angry at first because it felt like his mom was pushing him toward me for practical reasons, not emotional ones. But over the past week, he'd thought about it and realized what I was asking wasn't unfair. He told me he was grateful I'd even forgiven him after how badly he'd treated me for years. While the idea of being financially independent was scary, he understood it was necessary for us to move forward with a fresh start. I let him know that, despite what his mom had hinted, there was money set aside for him in our will. I offered to help him access some of it until he found a job, but he surprised me by saying no. He wanted to do this on his own, saying he needed to prove to himself and to me that his change of heart was real. I've always depended on someone else, he said. First mom, then you and my grandparents. Maybe it's time I learned to stand on my own 2 feet. I respected his choice, and we spent the rest of the weekend planning his job search. For the first time, I felt proud of him, not out of obligation, but because I could see he was really trying. 3 days later, George and Patricia called me, furious. They yelled at me for cutting off Michael's financial support and making him work his way through college. I tried to explain that this was something we both agreed on and that I had even offered to help him with the money his mom left behind, but they didn't want to hear it. They called me selfish, saying I was keeping all the money for myself. You've just been looking for an excuse to ditch him, George yelled. Patricia jumped in, saying, you never wanted him in the first place. His mom would be so disappointed in you. After everything our family's been through, this is how you treat her son. When they wouldn't let me explain, I hung up and blocked their numbers. I called Michael to figure out what was going on. He told me he'd casually mentioned to his grandparents that he was looking for a job because he wanted to be financially independent. They offered to give him more money, but he said no, explaining that this was something he needed to do on his own. George and Patricia jumped to the conclusion that I had forced him into it and demanded I keep supporting him like I had been for the past 2 years. I told Michael I didn't feel like I owed his grandparents an explanation. This was between him and me, and if he was okay with our arrangement, their opinion didn't matter to me. Michael apologized for the mix-up and offered to talk to his grandparents, but I told him to focus on his studies and job search instead. Their outburst had an unexpected upside. I no longer felt like I had to stay in touch with them. As for Michael and me, our relationship was finally becoming real, based on mutual respect instead of obligation or money. But now, I'm about to test my stepson's loyalty after finding a worrying letter. Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since I last posted. I've talked to my brother and a therapist about everything going on, and it's helped me sort through my emotions. My brother brought up a good point I hadn't thought about. By encouraging Michael to be more independent, I might actually be helping him in the long run by teaching him to rely on himself. My therapist also helped me deal with my own feelings of guilt and sadness, reminding me that setting boundaries doesn't mean I'm abandoning him. Michael has come over twice since then. The first time, he told me he got a part-time job. It doesn't pay a lot, but it helps cover some of his everyday costs. He's also applied to be a resident advisor next semester, which would give him free housing and a bit of spending money. That weekend, we went over his budget together. Even with the job, he's still a bit short on tuition. I mentioned the money his mom left for him, but he still doesn't want to use it. Instead, he's applying for more scholarships and thinking about taking out a student loan for what's left. His determination to figure this out on his own really impresses me. The second time he visited, Michael brought a folder full of scholarship applications. Almost 20 of them. Each one needed essays and recommendations, and he had everything organized perfectly, with spreadsheets to keep track of deadlines and requirements. I've never seen him take so much initiative before. What really surprised me, though, was how he handled his grandparents. After finding out what they were up to, he called them directly and told them to stop meddling. According to Michael, the conversation didn't go well. They accused me of brainwashing him and even threatened to cut off his allowance if he didn't come to his senses. But Michael stood his ground and told them they could keep their money. That made me believe even more that his change of heart is real. Later, he told me that he should have stood up to his grandparents years ago, especially when they were causing problems between me and his mom. They always made me feel like I had to pick between you and my dad's memory, he said. I didn't realize how messed up that was until now.